You ready to go?
Yes.
Are we live?
Yep.
Great. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rachel Rees toku ingoa. Ko rauti koro mātua whakatū. Tēnā koutou. Welcome to you this evening, and thank you for joining our webinar on Three Waters Reform. I'm pleased to be here with Pat Doherty, the Chief Executive of Nelson City Council, and Jason Crook, the Deputy Chief Executive Advocacy from Local Government New Zealand. Thank you both for being part of this webinar this evening. We have a few housekeeping matters just to run through, and I'm going to invite Paul Shattuck just to give you a few instructions on how to participate in tonight's webinar. So Paul, I'll hand across to you.
Kia ora, Rachel. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Paul Shattuck toku ingoa. My name's Paul Shattuck. I'm the Manager of Community Engagement here at Nelson City Council. Just a little bit of housekeeping rules for this webinar. So we're planning to have the webinar to run for about an hour long. So we just want to be respectful of everyone's time. So an hour is a long time to spend on a Zoom webinar call. We are recording this session. So, and we're also actually streaming it directly to YouTube as well. So if you have an inclination, you can actually go back and watch the session again if you do want to. So we're making sure that's available for everyone. During this webinar, you can actually ask questions. So if you see at the bottom of your screen, you can see a little Q&A button. And that little Q&A button is the question and answer button. So if you click on that, and you can type some questions away, and that will go to the panelists. So panelists who you see on the screen, and we'll be able to answer those questions. There will be presentations, so as we go through, we may actually answer some of those questions that do pop up. And any questions that are left at the end or are upvoted, so you can actually click on the thumbs up on some of those questions, and the higher the ones that get upvoted, then we'll make sure that those questions are answered again to make sure that everyone's happy with that. So if there are questions that we don't get to during the session, then we'll actually make sure that we try and get answers to those and put them on our Shape Nelson. So that's the shape.nelson.govt.nz. That's our engagement website where you can get a lot of information more about the Three Waters reforms. With your questions, please be respectful with your questions, and we will do our best to answer those. So I suppose that covers off the housekeeping, and we'll do what we can. So back to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Paul. So welcome. So I'm Rachel Rees, the Mayor of Nelson. We're probably in local government having a conversation that for many of you will be quite new. For me, it's not the first time I've had this conversation around how are we going to deliver water services in New Zealand, and what's the structure and the process that we need for delivering good quality, affordable water and maintaining environmental standards for New Zealanders. It's interesting, I have been involved in local government now for nearly 14 years, coming in for 15 years next year, and I'm a member of the National Council of Local Government New Zealand, but my first really big discussion around Three Waters reform was before I was a national councillor and back when Lawrence Yule was the president of Local Government New Zealand. And at that point, local government was saying to the government of the day, and had been for some time before that, that the model of delivering water infrastructure with the funding stream that we have is just not viable for the future. It's taken some time, and when I go back now and look at some of the documents, and one even today, I found a very interesting proposal from the Turnbull Group written in 2009. It's worth going to have a look at it. Go and Google it. And actually a lot of what is in there is the conversation we're having now. We are at a point where I think for councils around New Zealand, we've built our long-term plans, and we've seen the proportion of your funding that is now, if you're a ratepayer, going into supporting Three Waters infrastructure delivery. We also know that climate change impacts are going to increasingly create change for us, as well as environmental standards. But some of the other speakers will talk a little bit more around that. I think the most important thing this evening to say is that the government has given local governments, councils throughout New Zealand, an opportunity to really ask questions about the proposal. Some parts of that proposal, it's fair to say that as a National Council member and someone who's been involved as part of the steering group for Three Waters reform, some elements of that aren't still gelling for me as a mayor of our city. And so they need to be tested some more. And we've been invited to put back some alternative proposals on elements around governance, placemaking, how we maintain accountability through these structures to local communities. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit further. But this period is around understanding the model, asking questions and giving feedback through to the government. We're not being asked to make any decisions, but what we're interested in is your ideas. So it's an opportunity tonight, not just to listen and be informed, but actually to participate. So just remember Paul's guidance, use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. So that's the one you use tonight to feed up your questions. So again, thanks for joining us, and I'll hand across to Jason, who's going to talk a bit about the National Case for Change. Thanks, Jason, and welcome.
Kia ora and good evening. As Rachel said, my name is Jason Krupp. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive in charge of policy and advocacy at Local Government New Zealand. And I must apologise because it's impossible to talk about water without engaging in puns. So if you hear a couple of puns tonight, I beg your indulgence. So for the past 3 years or so, I've been swimming in Three Waters policy, so to speak, when I started my job at LGNZ. And so have been on a long and winding journey. So it's kind of appropriate that I tell you how we are here today with the proposal that the government has in front of communities. And really, you know, I think in many respects, the catalyst for the reform program that we're looking at was the Havelock North water contamination incident. And as a reminder, for those of you out there, this happened in 2016. And what happened was there was a bore contamination incident that resulted in 5,500 cases of Campylobacter poisoning. So people really had, a bad gastro, and is linked to 4 deaths. And what it did was it got central government to look into the regulatory systems in New Zealand around how we got to how this incident actually occurred. And while it was the catalyst, you have to look back many decades to really the cause of it. And that's that we really had poor stewardship over water in New Zealand across the board. So, you know, from a drinking water point of view, you know, there was certainly massive improvements that could be made across the system. But we also weren't tracking consents in the wastewater space. We weren't tracking breaches. We weren't tracking the quality of asset management plans, pipes. There was very little active regulatory action taken by people like the Ministry of Health. And so that's why I call that Havelock North event a catalyst to actually look at the system. And when you looked at it from a public health point of view, what you found was that about 30,000 people were getting sick from waterborne diseases each year. And while some of that was coming from private water networks, some of it was also attributable to public networks. Those are networks that councils have owned. And when we go back across the history, we see that there are a number of water contamination incidents. And so that led to the creation of Taumata Arawai and a real deep dive into the sector to see what's going on and to see what kind of intervention was needed. So when the government started looking into this, they found a real national case for change. And, you know, Rachel mentioned the Turnbull Group from 2009 saying we need to intervene in water because the model isn't actually sustainable. Well, I've got a letter from 1999 from the then Minister of Local Government, Maurice Williamson, who was writing to Metro Council saying, can we get into some form of water reform? Because what we know is that small rural councils just don't have the size of population base to pay for the kind of investments they need in order to lift their infrastructure up to the level that's required. That level that's required is becoming increasingly stark and increasingly clear as we've done a deep dive into, and councils have done the work on this, a deep dive into the asset management plans, the condition of the infrastructure, and also the financing. And what we have discovered is that there is somewhere between a $120 billion and $180 billion infrastructure deficit that exists in the Three Water space. Now, that's the product of some modelling done by the water industry of Scotland, but we vouchsafed it and tested it independently, and that is the gap we're actually looking at. So there's a strong view that there, and I think well supported by the evidence out there, that there is a case for change. We have to do something differently. The question is what? So to that end, and given the case in front of us, what the government has done is commission the water industry of Scotland to take their experience in Europe and say, with your model, could you apply it to New Zealand, and could we see the same gains? And one of the things that is clear is that the Scottish water model worked fundamentally well for Scotland. It has produced some really good, phenomenal results over there. And Wix have in turn, which is, as I said, the water industry of Scotland, have turned that into a reform methodology. So Wix have done some analysis, quite a significant amount of analysis on top of the data gathering exercise, and really showed a path to with reform as proposed by Wix versus the path if councils carried on their own. Now, I think it's important to point out here that when we're talking about councils on their own and the Wix model, that this is underpinned by an absolutely separate set of regulatory changes out there in the market. So, you know, in response to Havelock North, we've seen the standing up of a drinking water regulator called Taumata Arawai. Regional councils who are existing environmental regulators have been given also a very clear direction from central government, principally through the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water, that they will have to enforce consents from wastewater discharges, and also we're likely to see economic regulation. And so all of these things went into the modelling. What we found is that when you look at this, there are significant savings that are potentially made under the Wix methodology versus the business as usual case under councils. Now, what the government's proposal on the Wix methodology recommends is that councils basically vest their Three Waters assets into larger entities. And this comes from a rich body of economic evidence that shows that scale is vitally important when it comes to the provision of infrastructure services. And really what that rests on is the number of people you have within a kind of water services entity catchment. The bigger that number is to a point, the more ability you have to cross-subsidize within that organization. And what you end up with is the, cities subsidizing small rural areas. And we have done various sets of modeling and scenario testing and stress testing and Monte Carlo analyses to find out where that sweet spot is in New Zealand relative to our country, our circumstances, our economy. And so this is where the government's got to on its Three Waters proposal. So if whoever's running the slide deck could put up slide 7. Okay, I think I might be able to share it from my side, if you just give me 1 second. There we are. So what the government is proposing is that we set up 4 entities. And how they've come to this 4-entity model is that the analysis of New Zealand's particular characteristics shows that New Zealand's characteristic shows that it's somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million people is the sweet spot for where you get economies of scale, but before you tip into diseconomies of scale. And the economics is one layer that we've looked at. The other one is the distribution of cities within those maps. So you need big, strong core urban areas to do cross-subsidization. And the third one is, how do we actually deliver a model within the cultural context of New Zealand? So all of these factors went into an analysis process and careful consideration, and Cabinet reviewed all the recommendations, and where we've ended up on is 4 entities, and those entities are displayed on the screen in front of you. Just to go through them in some detail, is Auckland northwards, that includes all the 4 Northland councils, would be Entity A, reflecting that yes, this gives you a population base that's slightly bigger than what we would consider optimal, but there are very few options when it comes to Auckland and Northland. Entity B would be Taranaki, the Waikato, the Bay of Plenty, and Taupo, that broad section there, which gives you a decent population base of about 800,000 people. Entity C largely goes from Wellington up the east coast all the way to Gisborne and the Hawke's Bay, which has a population centre of about 1 million people. And that also includes the top of the south. And so, of course, that affects Nelson, Marlborough and Tasman. And this really is a reflection of the tribal boundaries and cultural preferences of iwi Māori in this space. And the last entity is, of course, Entity D, which is Christchurch. So this is the reform proposal on the table. Now, one of the questions we started with, but a question I get asked again and again is, how do we know this will work? How do we know this is the right modelling? How can we trust the modelling and the data? And as I said, this is exactly where we as LGNZ, who had a seat at the table and were, our role was to be a questioner and a challenger and a tester, also started from. And, you know, my team has spent a significant amount of work doing exactly that. We've also tested it with independent economic analysts, and we've also contributed to the peer review process that has been co-commissioned between LGNZ, Tai Tuaroa, and the government. That work was undertaken by Farrier Swear, who got to look under the hood to test the methodology and the assumptions. And that work has come out and said, you know, notwithstanding that, you know, all models are wrong, particularly when you look over a 30-year period, some models are useful because they give you a clear direction that there will be gains from a particular path of reform, and certainly the WICS modelling and the WICS and the government's model on the table does give them confidence that there will be gains to the system. We undertook a further piece of analysis, and that was jointly on the work being done, and that was to ensure that the economic settings within the model around what are the standards, what are the investment levels, etc., are they appropriate to New Zealand or are they appropriate to Scotland, where this model is based? That work was undertaken by Becker, who did a peer review of those assumptions, and they broadly found that that if there was a slight mismatch between those assumptions, when you looked at the direction of travel, New Zealand was very much, in terms of water standards, heading to where Europe is heading. So when you put this all together, what the government is saying is that the regulatory environment is changing on one hand, and this will create very high standards that councils will have to meet. They see affordability challenges, particularly for small rural and provincial councils, in meeting these regulatory challenges in the drinking water and wastewater space particularly. And on the other hand, here is a reform package that we think will give councils the ability to answer those reforms. Now, I've glossed over this at a very high level, and more than happy to get into the detail as we answer questions. But I think I've given you a good overview of the package, the current regulatory environment we're emerging into, and now's probably a good time to hand over to Pat, who can go into what does this mean at a Nelson level.
Thanks, Jason. Remember to unmute myself, always key on these things. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the specifics for Nelson. So this is a snapshot of part of the dashboard that WICS prepared for Nelson City. So you can see 3 numbers there: $1,050 That's our current number. Wix are forecasting that if we continue to stand alone by 2051, that number will become $2,330. And if we join in as part of Entity C, that number will be $1,260. Now, I just emphasize that all those numbers are in today's dollars. There's no inflation in them. So you'll be aware that the numbers for councils throughout New Zealand for that, if you don't join in the reforms, range from about $1,900 through to over $8,000 per household. Those numbers include revenue for us for water by meter, our wastewater charges, and our stormwater charges. So that's the total cost that the average household pays. In actual fact, our number is 1128. The 1,050 is based on the Wix modelling from the data we provided in November, December. The number from our annual plan for this year is 1128, excluding GST. So they were pretty close. So while the national case is compelling, it's not as strong as other parts of the country. And that's to do with our geographical advantages. We're a compact urban area, but also the investment that the council has put into its 3 water assets over the last over 30 years or so. But still, the difference between in reform and out of reform is over $1,000 per household in 30 years' time, that's a big chunk of money. That requires our attention. I mean, that's money that's going to fall on our ratepayers, and so we do have to think carefully about these proposals. Could I move on to the next slide, please? So one of the things we've done is we got Morrison Lowe to do an assessment of how accurate the Wix data was for our council. That report's on our website, and if you go and look at our first Zoom web workshop, you'll see that Dan Bonifant talking about these numbers. So if you look at the green box, council alone, on the right-hand side, you'll see 2 numbers, 2164 and 2443. That's the range of numbers they think if they corrected for different approaches that Wix took to the modelling as compared to how Morrison Lowe would do it. The number that Morrison Lowe came up with was $2,330, smack bang between those 2 areas on the right-hand side. And then if you look up to the blue box, which is Entity C, the arrow in the middle talks about the base case, $1,260. That's where Wix think Entity C can deliver. If Wix can only achieve half the efficiencies, if this Entity C can only achieve half the efficiencies that Wix are projecting, then that number turns into $1,685. Still well below the $2,330 that is modelled for Nelson. The only way that number, that the council costs get down below the Entity C costs, is if we combine Wix 50% of the Wix efficiencies for Entity C and reduce the investment that Wix think that we need to spend by half as well. And that's actually less than what we're projecting for our costs. So Morrison Lowe's view, and I just want to quote it exactly from their presentation, overall we note that while the projected household charges from the Wix analysis may be the subject of some contention, in our view they are directionally accurate. That is, household charges will increase in the new regulatory environment, and Nelson ratepayers are likely to have lower household charges under the proposed entity delivery model than through continued council service delivery. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So here's a summary of our asset values at the moment. Now these are our accounting values. So the land is revalued at current market value. Buildings are based on historical cost, less depreciation, and infrastructure is revalued at replacement costs, less accumulated depreciation. So what you see in the left-hand column is our actual costs, the value of our assets at 30th of June 21, and the right-hand column is showing those assets, if we stick to our long-term plan projections, that by 1 July 2024, the total value of those assets will be $716 million. Now, one of the things I have to be just also remind you is we're not sure what stormwater assets would transfer. So that's assuming all stormwater assets would transfer, $716 million. So next slide, please. So again, if you look at the right-hand column, you'll see that that if we stick with our long-term plan, by 1 July 2024, our net debt is $192 million and our revenue is 145.8. And that produces a debt to revenue ratio of 132%. Now, you want your debt to revenue ratio to be low. That's good. The higher that debt to revenue ratio gets, what it means is the more of your income you spend on repaying debt. So if you look at our three waters standing on its own, by 1 July 2024, we'll have $81.5 million worth of debt and $36.8 million worth of revenue. So the three waters debt to revenue ratio, if broken out, is 222%. So you can see that exactly what I talked about. The council has invested a lot of money in its three water assets and is carrying a lot of debt associated with it. So it's more heavily burdened with debt than the rest of our activities. If we take that debt out, then it's the bottom three figures. Our debt drops to 110.4 million, our revenue drops to 109 million, and our debt to revenue ratio drops to 101%. Now, this also assumes that DIA analysis would support our debt analysis, but in that we run closed accounts for these three accounts, we think that we would be pretty comfortable with the numbers we're projecting. So one of the things I want to talk about is there has been a lot of talk of this is a sale of assets, and that's not how I see it. For a start, the idea of selling the assets to the water supply entities was raised very early in the process. But the fact is that if we sold these assets to a company for $700 million, and every one of the other 22 councils within water supply entity C did the same, that water services entity would be absolutely crippled with debt and wouldn't be able to afford the extra investment to address water, wastewater, and stormwater challenges over the next 30 years. The other thing is, if we sold those assets to water services entity C, then our water supply customers, the ones that use our water, wastewater, and stormwater assets, would start to repay those debts again. I mean, they've already paid down a lot of that debt. So I think the way to look at that is that the council holds these assets on behalf of the community. This water services entity C would do the same. I mean, really, if you sell something, then you no longer have use of those assets. Our Three Waters customers will still have use of these assets and still be benefiting from them. Next slide, please. So there's a projection of our debt to revenue ratios. The blue line is without the transfer, and the orange line is with transfer. So if the transfer happens around about 23, 24, then our debt to revenue ratio peaks at about, looks like about 130%, but falls down to about 100% by 3031. Whereas you can see that if Three Waters stays with us, then our debt in 2020, 24, 25 is about 150%, peaks to about 160%, and then drops down to just over 150%. So you can see there is quite a difference for the council in a positive way if the Three Water assets transfer and the debt associated with them transfers as well, because that is the proposal, that effectively we would transfer some $700 million worth of assets and receive a debt repayment of $81.5 million. So I'll hand back to Jason to talk through the government financial package. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. And Jason, I'm handing back to you. I'm just conscious we've got lots and lots of questions in there, so we'll see how we go. If we can't get to everyone's questions tonight, we will make sure we answer them and put them up on Shape Nelson.
Look, I will endeavour to be brief here because I think the real richness comes from those questions. So, look, the government has put up there are two financial packages on the table here. There is what we're calling the better off package, and the other one is the no worse off package. And they're to address different sides of the reforms. Now, the no worse off package is probably a good place to start. What that recognises is were this reform proposal to go ahead, it would not be without a financial impact on councils' balance sheets, and that there has to be some recompense to that impact if this thing is to be fair. And so that's why it's called the no worse off. And the intention behind this is to put up a $500 million facility to compensate councils should they be in a place where they incur stranded assets, or there are particular costs to those councils, or the debt borrowing capacity is reduced in some form. And the idea is that, the day one before the reform date or the day before the reform stand up and become active, and the next day afterwards, councils would be in no worse off a position. So as I said, there's a $500 million facility there, and that is an uncapped facility. So best guess, it's $500 million. If it's higher than $500 million, the government will fund that difference. The other side of it is what we're calling the better off package. And there are two elements to the better off package. Well, first of all is the quantum of the better off package. That is a $2 million facility that's been put forward so that councils can share in some of the benefits of these reforms. And that reflects that many of the gains from these reforms come, 10 years after the establishment of these entities and after they've set themselves up and start driving our costs. So it's future generations who will benefit from these reforms, but that by providing some financial incentive now, that is a way to kind of help present generations share in the efficiencies of these reforms. The other side of that is a recognition that in many respects, you probably would have started off with a what is the future role and function of local government conversation, and then worked your way to three waters. But politics is never a straight path, and so we started with we've started with water reform, and this $2 billion I would describe as a show of good faith that central government has in councils on their ability to invest in their communities, and so those are what's on the table. Are they incentive packages to help you convince you of the merits of this reform? Absolutely. We at LGNZ played a pivotal role in negotiating them and negotiating the quantum that's on the table. So yes, I hope they are an incentive that gets you to consider these reforms and the benefits of what you could use this money for communities. It does come with some trade-offs. One of them is by moving into these larger central government entities, is that you of course, go from owning 100% of a very small pie to owning a small slice of a very large pie. And that comes with some governance trade-offs in it. And the government is proposing that when you get to entities of this size, it's quite challenging actually having everybody represented on a governance group that would inform the establishment of these boards, and then it would like to reduce it to a workable number. Right now the offer on the table is about 6 local government representatives and 6 mana whenua representatives. That reflects a strong direction that we've got from this government, that they really want to embed co-governance as outlined in the Treaty of Waitangi into public decision making. Now, this regional representative group will have a different role from how we understand councils currently direct their CCOs, and their responsibility in this space will be to set strategic direction, but it will be by necessity here's a picture of what that governance group looks like. It will be by necessity arm's length from the board, because one of the key elements that's central to this reform and that we see has been critical to success of other reforms like this is that you need a professional competency board. So these are, as you would establish a private sector board, to run these water services entities. And the role of the regional representative group is to provide strategic and performance expectations in the form of a statement of intent or letter of intent. And these will be matched by your planning documents. And it is the job of the water services entity to take these, the statement of intent and also the planning documents, and then develop an investment plan and let the constituents of that water services entity know where it's going to invest. Now, within this is baked some anti-privatization initiatives. So one is that should any councils within that entity want to privatize, they would need to pass a 75% referendum threshold in order to privatize. And the other one is also that iwi are a co-partner in the space. And as you're aware, iwi are long-term investors and would certainly, in my opinion, be quite resistant to any privatization efforts in this space. What it does also give you, and I apologize for this diagram, this is a product of a policy process, and it's not always the best to kind of digest on a webinar, but what it also allows you to do by having that governance separation is really lift the amount that these entities can borrow relative to councils. So that would give them a huge financial impetus. In order to make up for that 180 to 120 billion dollar infrastructure deficit. I appreciate that can be a little bit challenging from the outset, and I think it'd be interesting to get some of the perspectives from local and certainly from local councils about how they're seeing this governance approach. Rachel, do you have any observations here?
Thanks, Jason, I do. And look, I've been meeting with councils around New Zealand, and very much this is one of the areas where there are quite a lot of questions and quite a lot of feedback. And I think the challenge at the moment is getting the balance sheet separation that Jason's talked about to allow the entities to borrow, and they can borrow at a rate much higher than councils can borrow. So we've got to separate them out for that purpose. But the stretch between the government's influence and the board just at the moment probably to me feels a bit far, and that's been the feedback from many councils around New Zealand. So we're certainly going to be teasing out those models, and we've been asked, specifically to look at that to give our feedback on what works, what doesn't work within there. I think the part of that model that we have to remember is we've now got an economic regulator. That's in the model that Jason's got up on the screen now. That'll be a new thing, and so is Taumata Arawai, who is our environmental regulator, and that's the whole kind of system change that we're about to see, and that's part of the reason why the status quo model we don't believe is fit for purpose for New Zealand anymore. And I think that national case for change has been made. We've got some good questions about the individually for Nelson as to what it looks like for Nelson, but yeah, Jason, I think we've had feedback around looking at cooperative models, looking at whether we could find a way to just bring the governance influence at local democracy level closer to the board of the entities. But I think the thing, and I've heard Pat talk about this, that these entities will be working in a glass office, is what he's described. They will have to be doing public reporting. They will have to be they will be consulting the community. Those of you who are listening this evening, you'll be able to give your feedback directly to those entities about what you think they're doing well, what they're not doing well. And of course, our long-term plans will be the starting point if the government decides to proceed and stand the entities up. Our long-term plans will be the beginning point for their program of works. Jason, is there anything else you wanted to add at this point, or will we cross across to questions?
Well, just before we cross across to questions, I think the one point that probably needs to be emphasized, which isn't immediately available from this diagram, is how consumer protection is built in across the model. So these entities will be required to stand up consumer panels to get them direct feedback about the quality of their service, how quickly they're responding to breakages and maintenance, etc., etc. There will also be the economic regulator who will have a customer protection mandate, recognizing that there's a real imbalance between a monopoly and an individual customer, and so you need a third party to ensure that. And then on top of that, there is very much seen a future role for councils to be advocates for their communities in this space, so that you have a sophisticated entity engaging with a sophisticated entity. So I think that's also quite a big change on the status quo, is how big a focus there is on consumers of these services.
Great, thanks, Jason. Look, I think what we'll do is we'll maybe come off, we'll finish the share screen. And I think, look, we've got lots and lots of questions here. So, Paul, I'm conscious that you're going to help us with those questions. We can see them. So I'm assuming our viewers can see them as well as we go through them. So maybe we can speed this up a little. So we'll just see if we can maybe make that work for us. So I can see the first question, and you, if I get this in a muddle, Paul, you'll pop in and help. So the first question is around, why aren't we having a binding referendum? And do you realise it's a requirement under the Local Bodies Act? Under the LG, I don't think so, but I'll hand across to Jason as to the why. And if we were going to do it, the when, or not us, when you do it.
Yeah, well, a couple of points on the referendum. One is that for a referendum to be effective, you need a A/B type choice. What the government has put forward is a model that's probably 85% there, and that's what the 8-week period is for, is to get council feedback and direct feedback from the, it's left Wellington and the policy development process. Now let's let it get feedback from real world practitioners in the space, what works, what doesn't work. And that's where we'll get to the point where there's a final model on the table once that feedback's taken on board. So, if there's a referendum now, you're not really left with a true A/B choice in front of you, largely because the model is still developing. The path to reform, once that model is on the table, can be discussed at future dates. The other thing I would caution about is we need to be very careful about referenda generally, because if you don't design them very carefully, you can end up with some surprising outcomes. And certainly Brexit and a couple of the West Coast referenda have taught us that we need to be cautious in this space. We've got other channels in the space besides referenda. Consultation is a good one, a well-established channel for dealing with the complexity of the space, because I don't think we'll ever get to an A/B choice in this if we're being fair and evidence-based.
Thanks, Jason. That's really, I think that's a very good way of describing where we're at. And I have thought, if this is obviously if the government decides to proceed, this goes through a full legislative process, including all the select committee processes. So until we get to, there's the ability to influence through that space. But this is, before I go to the next question, I think, which I will in a moment, and I'll probably, for Pat, can answer the next one. I just want to talk a little bit about part of that question from Mark, and that's in terms of the roles that both I have had on behalf of Local Government New Zealand and the role that Pat has had on behalf of Kaitoura. So we've been sitting on in the joint steering group, but having the opportunity to actually ask questions about this proposal over the last few months, nearly a year now. And that's an unusual step, actually, in where you bring forward government proposals and legislation. It doesn't happen very often. So this is a new way of operating where local government have advocated to say, look, we want to be at the table, actually being part of this discussion and really testing and this model out, or whatever it is you're going to bring forward. Obviously, the decision still sits with Cabinet. And so it's the Cabinet's call about what they do. But we have had the ability to certainly interrogate what is there. We've had the ability to communicate what we don't like about it. And some of those things have been carved out as the areas that still need further feedback from the sector. So that's the role that we've played. We don't sit as the Mayor of Nelson or the Chief Executive of Nelson. We sit at that table as two people with good experience about the local government sector and good experience around infrastructure to really test this and create some tension to hopefully get a better model out the other end. We're not there yet. Now, Pat, there's a question there about Nelson's got great drinking water. agree with that. So what's the problem here?
So maybe I just talk a little bit about my background. So I arrived here in 1986 when the Maitai Dam was half built, and I was the drainage and water engineer for the council. So my first job was to get the Maitai Dam commissioned, get it up and running. I was involved with dramatically increasing our expenditure on new stormwater systems. I looked after the regional sewage business unit for a long time. I was a water engineer when we installed water meters, and the council sent me to the United States and Canada to pick the treatment plant and negotiate the contract for the plant that's been installed. So I have a pride of ownership of these systems, probably second to none in this meeting at the moment. So this is not a conversation I take lightly. But we're not just talking about drinking water, and ours is very good, but we're also talking about wastewater and stormwater standards rising as well. And that's where we think that there's going to be a lot of extra expense as the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management starts to take effect. So you took the question down, Paul. That was so we think there is a national case for change. There's no doubt about that, and I've said that freely. But you also heard me say that the case is not so compelling for Nelson. In fact, our number for the year 2050 is the second lowest in New Zealand. So we are one of the few councils that could stand on our own. But it's still a difference of $1,000 per household in uninflated terms in the year 2050. All we're saying is that deserves a conversation. And look, at the moment, neither the mayor nor the chief executive can agree to this. The government's asking us for our comments, which we are going to provide by the 1st of October, and then we wait to see what Cabinet does next.
If I could just back up what you said there, Pat, it's that wastewater space where the challenges really are. Under the previous government regimes, we had a Ministry of Works. It built a number of wastewater treatment plants around New Zealand. Those are all reaching the end of their life. And as a result of it, we're seeing a real bow wave of asset replacement coming at us. So about 60% of wastewater treatment plants will need to go for reconsenting in the next 10 years. And given the rising standards, and these are community standards, many of those plants will have to be rebuilt to meet those standards. And that is a significant cost for many councils across the board, and a key driver of this program.
Thanks, Jason. But I'll move on to the next question. And this is one Pat talking about the LTP. So what's been signed out, and then horrendously expensive library. I'll read the question for it. If we weren't doing that. Well, that's probably, if I think about the long-term plan, and it's the third one that I've done, it's been the hardest one by far. So what we've watched is a lot of our assets being revalued, and that means that the cost to replace them has gone up. So a lot more of our money is going into depreciation to put money aside. And when I think about what's left after we take out the Three Waters cost, there's not a lot left. So in communities, we, in the Local Government Act, we look at the four well-beings, and social well-being and economic well-being are important. We want to deliver as a community a range of services, and that includes libraries. It includes our recreational facilities, it includes our parks and reserves. And I guess the challenge that I would look at as Mayor is that I can see as we move through, perhaps not right now, because I think right now we've got things about right. But as we go further out into the next LTP and the one after that, that increasingly we are going to be focused on funding Three Waters, and there won't be much left for anything else. And I think that's the issue here, that the choices are getting very limited. So when I look at that as someone who has to pay rates and also has to pay taxes, I want to have an economically efficient system to deliver those services. And what we know from the model is that is a more economically efficient system to deliver those services to you. It means that we're paying less out as ratepayers and taxpayers if we were to ask the government to fund it to the same system. And I think that's part of what sits behind the model. But Pat, do you want to just talk about the LTP and what you're seeing?
Yes, please. Paul, could you put up the last 3 slides on that presentation? But look, the LTP at the moment absolutely makes provision for the cost of our three waters. That there's no way in the wide world that, with my background, that I'm going to ever promote a long-term plan that does not look after our infrastructure properly. And we've got a mayor and a council that have been passionate about that. Even when I wasn't back here, I would read Rachel talking about the focus on infrastructure and starting to tackle some of our backlog. But what you see in front of you there is a projection of our expenditure on water supply capex for the next 10 years, and then from our infrastructure strategy broken down into 5-year periods. So you can see there's a real step change in the amount of capital investment we have to put into our water supply alone. Now, some of that is because of rising standards, but some of that is because Stoke is starting to get old, and all the infrastructure that was put in the 90s and 50s, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s is going to need replacing. If you can go on to the next one, please. And there's wastewater doing exactly the same thing. Now, we've budgeted for climate change, and we've budgeted for that national policy statement on freshwater management. But I expect that over the next 3 years, as we learn to understand the implications of that more and more, some of these numbers are going to get bigger. And if you go on to the next one, which is stormwater, not such a dramatic increase, but as you can see, we're already spending reasonable sizable chunks of money on stormwater. So there is a bow wave of renewals facing our council, plus the extra money to respond to climate change, plus the extra cost of meeting rising wastewater standards and stormwater standards. One of the things our stormwater budget provides for at the moment is quantity. We focus on getting the stormwater to the coast, but very soon we're going to have to start improving the quality of it as it discharges to our rivers and streams, and that's going to be expensive as well. So there are challenges facing us.
Thanks, Pat. Now, next question is from Glenn. I think it's from Glenn. Yeah. Okay. Why not simply give local bodies the cash to upgrade? They need, instead of around the need for an out-of-town ownership of assets. Okay, so a couple of things there. And I'll give a quick answer, which is I am a ratepayer and a taxpayer. And I think if the cash was given out as grants by the government directly to councils, we're not getting the efficiencies that we need through the scale benefits that we'd see. It wouldn't be an effective and efficient way to actually get the gains that we need. And some of that is also around the ability to bring, to allow for capital investment in New Zealand. So it's very difficult at small scale to invest in the type of infrastructure equipment, the modelling work that you need to actually deliver to the best practice that we see on international standards. We're just not operating at that point at the moment. But does anyone else want to add anything to that one? Jason or Pat, or is that well enough covered?
I think also the role of how, when you look at the history of subsidies, and these would be a subsidy, and we have quite a rich data set in New Zealand, is that when the going's good economically, then the subsidies are there. The minute you hit a change in the business cycle and the government has to tighten its belt, almost always these are the first subsidies to be cut. And that's why you see some very lumpy investment profiles where you operate in a subsidy regime. So it's just not sustainable.
Thanks, Jason. Now, I have ended up down the bottom of the question somehow, so here we go, back at the top.
Rachel, I'll just jump in there. We've actually had a number of questions in the chat. There's quite a few questions which relate to engagement with the public, and why haven't we engaged with the public like some other councils around the country have engaged with putting out surveys and things like that. So why are we at this stage? Why haven't we engaged when others have?
Thanks, Paul. So part of our engagement is around sharing information that we have tonight. So we're at the information sharing stage. We're not at the decision-making stage. And I think we've talked already about why that is, because at the moment, we haven't got that proposal to look at, and we haven't got something that we could go and test with the community for all of the details. There are gaps there. So the 8-week period was intended very much for councils, elected members, to be able to look at the information that the Department of Internal Affairs had produced, go through that, look at that in detail, and look at that for how it influenced and impacted their council areas. So that's the reason that we've taken that approach. Some councils have taken other approaches and put out questions. I've seen other polls going on about, which I would say some of them have got a fair amount of disinformation in them, but that's the approach that we've taken. What we will see is what the next step is going to be, and as to whether we need to come and do a full consultation. So for this, if we were going to go through that process, we'd have to put a lot of information together, some of which we don't have the full disclosure on at the moment, because I think not all of that information has been decided, in order to put a proper proposal out that you could consider. What we will be doing is receiving a report to the council meeting, where I think that's next week. Gosh, I think so. Pat, you'll have to help me if I've got that wrong. Yes, it goes thumbs up there. And that'll go through asking us to provide our feedback to the government and stepping us through what it is that we can see at this point. But Jason, you've probably been out and about a bit around the country too, just seeing what other councils are doing. Is there something we could be doing here that we're missing at the moment?
Look, I think I'll rest. I think I'll go back to my AB answer in terms of the referendum. The same thing applies with consultation. You have to know what you're consulting on. And so you would need that 85% developed model to get to 100%, so you could have certainty on what you're consulting on. I think the challenge in front of councils is not the government's model or the status quo, as I said earlier. It's the government's model, or how councils will meet will meet these rising costs and the investment profile ahead of them. So, there's still a fair amount of work to be done before you can get to that consultation phase, but certainly there's no public policy, significant public policy, that doesn't happen without consultation in New Zealand. So there will be a consultation phase, and it's appropriate. Some councils have chosen to go out, and I think I've spoken to all of them by now, and do a feedback campaign to gauge and help shape their feedback to the proposal, but it's not more developed than that. There's no consultation because there is no A/B choice, so to speak.
Thanks, Jason. And I think we might look at opportunities on Shape Nelson for you to provide your feedback, so we can do it that way. We'd love to have been seeing you all in person tonight, but unfortunately, a little problem, COVID-19 has meant that we were going to be on really restricted numbers to be able to meet in person today, and all the physical spacing that's required around that. So we really felt that would mean that we were excluding too many people. So the better thing was to do this online for those who can attend this evening, and then people who can watch it later if they want to. Now, Paul, are there any other ones in that list that I should be pulling up? Will we go to the next one?
Yeah, I'll jump to the next one.
Right, next one is, if the majority are against this reform, I think that's the issue that we're dealing with, which we're just covering, is that we really haven't got, we've got to put together all the information so that people would actually have a clear view and understanding around that choice. Why is the boundary so broad, continuing up into the North Island? That's a really good question. And that's a cabinet decision. So cabinet made the decision about how many entities. It could have been one, like Scotland. They decided that they would go for 4. You do need sort of over 800,000 people to get the economy of scale in the entity. So that's kind of the test amount. We could have been in the rest of the South Island, but the decision's been made at cabinet level to join us with Wellington and the east coast of the North Island. We have got been asked for some feedback around where will those boundaries be. So there's a discussion here about Māori tribal boundaries. That's correct. So no, that is, I won't form a view on that, because that's not for me to say. There is a boundary that has been shown. It crosses over Tasman's border and Marlborough's border. And so the 3 councils have been quite consistent in their feedback to the government to say that's not something we would support. We believe that the boundaries should stay with local authority boundaries. So that's essentially where we are at that point. And I think the reason in the testing, the government's, I think, and Jason, you might jump in here, or Pat, is around what they wanted was some tension around this model. They didn't want just to go to one entity and end up with a monopoly. They really want to get some testing. So anything to add, Jason, and then I'll cross to Pat.
Yes, that's one of the, to that A/B choice, one of the things that the government's looking for is feedback on those boundaries. And certainly we've received quite a lot on the boundary between entity B and entity C. So that's, Waikato and the Manawatu Wellington area. But certainly this is what they want to test. And we need to know where those boundaries are before you can go out the other side and say this is the final model.
Thanks. Pat, anything to add?
So DIA, like the Scottish water model, it's public ownership, but achieves the efficiencies that the English water supply companies do. But initially there were three. One had Edinburgh, one had Glasgow, and the other one had the north of Scotland. And the price of water in the north of Scotland was out of balance, and they had to combine them into one. DIA liked the idea of having somewhere between 3 and 5, but they did a huge amount of modelling on this. They talked with the credit rating agencies about the financial sustainability of them, and in the end they've come up with this structure where there is a price range across the 4 entities. The government considers that's at an acceptable level. One of the things I did want to point out is that even Auckland Council with Watercare win out of this. At the moment, I think that if they continue to stand alone as Watercare, their cost is projected to be $1,900 a year in 2050, and if they're in Area A, it drops to $800. So every water supply entity in New Zealand benefits from being in these bigger companies. It's just that some benefit more than others, and the ones that benefit the most are the rural councils with more dispersed populations, where they have a real challenge in terms of supplying their communities and meeting these rising standards.
Thanks, Pat. Look, we've done our hour, but I think there's enough questions. We'll take a couple more if Jason and Pat are okay with that. You're good on that? Okay, we'll take a couple more. So the next one is from Steve, and Steve is commenting on it's just disappeared on me, the layers of governance, it has disappeared on me, the layers of team. I think it was around the layers of governance and sort of steps that are sitting in there, and I've lost the rest of the question. My apologies, team. And I think, Steve, that's a fair call, and that's one of the things that we've been discussing is how do we get this close enough, and what is the customer's influence over an engagement with the entity. As Jason said before, I think actually the customers, with respect to the council services, but actually I have to say, I think that you'll end up with probably a closer customer relationship and a customer ability to influence. So just the level of accountability that's set into this model is very high. And if Pat or Jason had read that other question and had captured any more of it, then you're welcome to add something to that one.
Yeah, well, I can take a guess at your question because having spoken to 64 councils over the last 6 weeks on this topic, it is an issue that crops up. And I think what we're seeing is that was DIA's best guess of what a governance model should look like. It looked neat and clean on a piece of paper, and what's come clearly back over the 8-week period is that there needs to be more tension in the system and controls and feedback loops on those entities, and that governance is our primary place to ensure that there's accountability and legitimacy for these water services entities. Central government have heard that and are doing quite a bit of furious work behind the scenes. For my sins, I just spent 6 hours on a webinar while we pulled that stuff apart and try to put it back together. The other area that we've heard consistently, strong consistent feedback is that this model is very much built on a utility provider and a customer receiver of that service, and it certainly has enough protections in it from a customer point of view. It probably doesn't recognize sufficiently that there's a different kind of customer in addition to receivers of water services, and those are councils and their plans and the expectation that these water services entities will meet those, they will invest to meet those plans. And that's an area where we as LGNZ now and other councils have provided strong feedback to say there needs to be greater leverage to ensure that these water services entities deliver on plans.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to go on to the next question. I can see there's one there about privatisation, so I do want to cover that, but I'll come to that just in a second, so I'll make these reasonably quick. So next one, who wants to have a go at answering Glenn's one about why can't the assets be held in trust? Similar in a trust structure?
I guess they could, but in many respects, the model replicates a trust structure. So what councils are really swapping is direct control of these assets for a trust equity share of these assets. So it's not you could never sell that equity. So it is effectively held in trust. But these water services entities need to hold these assets in order to bolster up their balance sheets and to borrow at the level of leverage that they're available in the capital markets to make up for that infrastructure investment. Those assets weren't there as collateral. They wouldn't have that borrowing ability. And this model doesn't work without that borrowing ability. We would have, reform without the ability to deliver on the objectives of that reform without funding and financing.
Thanks, Jason. Next question or comment is from Mark, who says, I beg to differ about working well in Scotland. There are a lot of sort of blackwater breakouts happening there right now. So I'm not sure that I can comment on that one. What I can say is that we have not just been looking at Scotland, so through the webinars that Local Government New Zealand have been holding over and the engagement that we've been looking at Tasmania and Victoria as well. And I have also looked at the water services delivered in Scotland. So it's a fairly, not in Scotland, in Denmark. So it's a fairly consistent model and feedback around the value of scale and getting that separation away from our balance sheet. Pat, are you able to add anything to that one?
Yeah, so look, it's one of the things we have met by Zoom with the representatives of Scottish Water and with Wix on several occasions. And look, they're quite upfront. They haven't finished their journey yet. When they were established 20 years ago, they inherited a lot of combined water and wastewater and stormwater systems, which are incredibly expensive to separate. I mean, you're basically laying another entire stormwater or wastewater system in every street in your cities. And they've made a lot of progress with that, progress that they wouldn't have made if they'd stayed as being run by the local councils. But they haven't finished their journey, and they're quite transparent about that. But they've made far more progress at far more efficiency than otherwise. Can I just carry on? There's another repeating comment. Do we really believe that these sorts of efficiencies can be achieved? Well, Scottish Water have achieved these efficiencies. The economic regulator, which is Wix, set them a target of 2% improvement in efficiencies each year for the last 20 years, and they've done that. So this is not something that's pie in the sky. We're looking at the costs for providing these services in the UK and the EU, and they're all running at these levels. So it's not theoretical, where we have been shown real examples of how it's been achieved. And Tasmania have talked about the same thing in terms of the efficiencies they're getting from a bigger water supply company.
Yeah, just to add on your point there, Pat, the test for us is Watercare. Watercare preceding these reforms got Wix in to do an analysis of their operations. And Watercare are 10 years already down the journey that the government is proposing in front of local councils. And Wix said to Watercare that they wanted a 4.5% efficiency gain over time, whereas, once you break down the efficiencies in the Wix model, it's somewhere between 1.5 and 2% for the rest of New Zealand. And Watercare didn't blink. They said, great, we're up for 4.5%. So, looking at the Australian example around the efficiencies they gained there, they achieved some really high efficiency targets over a 30-year period they achieved in 10 years. So yes, they do look daunting, but when we look at the evidence out there, they are absolutely achievable.
Thanks, Jason. Next question is, what's the protective mechanism to prevent the three water entities being sold off in the future? And I understand there are a lot of questions in here about this around privatisation.
Yep.
So, the answer.
Look, let's acknowledge that in New Zealand, the power of Parliament is sovereign, and you can. There are a number of protections that are put in into legislation or proposed to be put into legislation with these models, where if you would need a 75% majority for all equity owners in a water services entity to approve a privatization motion, for a privatization motion to go ahead, which is an incredibly high threshold. I mean, most parliamentary democracies can't get across the 2/3 majority. That said, again, it doesn't protect you from the power of Parliament. But I think there are some very strong informal checks in this. And one of them is the iwi co-governance in this. And any government that approaches this is immediately, or with a privatization motion, is immediately picking a fight with every post-settlement iwi Māori group out across the landscape. And certainly my interactions with people in the capital markets when they wanted to find out more about this model had broadly acknowledged that that's, it's just a hurdle that's too hard for them to actually cross, and their interest has kind of waned off. So yes, there's you're right, institutionally, there's not the power of Parliament is sovereign, but ultimately, I think those informal arrangements are really robust against privatisation.
Thanks, Jason. And there's a follow-up question from Joe, which is around where is the 75 requirement? Why is there a 75% requirement around the decision making, and is that a veto? So that's the components that say to put barriers against privatisation, to say no, 75% of the representative groups have to say yes to change, some form of change. That 75% of the owner councils, because remember the councils are the owners of these entities, would have to say yes, and 75% of the customers would have to say yes. And so that is a very high threshold to get through. I mean, there would have to be some much better option on the table, I think, for people to say yes to that. There's a next question, which is also, I think, and Jason, you may have already answered this one, which is about what do you think the ratepayers and residents of Rodney think about bigger, given their experience in the super city?
Look, my experience in the local government sector is that you will always find grumps about service delivery, and I think that's to be respected because it shows people care about the services they receive. But if you look at the level of inwards investment that Rodney and Franklin received as part of the super city and water care reforms, they've been the net beneficiaries across the board. And there's no way standing up as individual district councils, they could have afforded those on their own given their population bases. So that, they are hands down beneficiaries. There are some issues at the margin in the water care model around the charging and people who aren't on water care supply, but they really are marginal issues and wouldn't necessarily be dealt with in the same way as these reforms. And I think, in many regards, Auckland has the lowest cost of water provision in the country. And really what these reforms are, the appeal of these reforms is to replicate those kinds of results across New Zealand. And that's essentially the basis of it.
Thanks, Jason. I'm really conscious that we've gone 15 minutes over what we said we'd do, and there are so many really good questions here that, but I think we probably do need to wind this up for tonight. We're going to come back again on, which night are we coming back? Thursday night. Let's go. You can tell I haven't looked that far ahead of my diary. So we are coming back on Thursday to do another session, and we'll go in and have some thinking about whether we run exactly the same session or whether we make some adjustments to tonight. So look, any feedback that you've got around that, please pop something onto Shape Nelson about what you'd like to hear more about. We're really keen on that, and we'll do our very best to answer some more of these questions. We'll gather them up and do our best to get them in there. But I just want to thank you for taking the time to join us tonight and listen, and great questions. And look, thank you to everyone who's been sending me emails. It's a really good sign that you care about your community, and that's always something that actually I really like as a mayor, to get the engagement from community. So fully understand the frustration of not meeting in person. Wish we'd been able to do that, but I think we're actually going to be able to reach more people this way. And as we move through the next steps, provide our feedback to central government, we may find that there is going to be a lot more engagement that goes on, depending on what the Prime Minister and Cabinet decide. That's not something that I am privy to or have any influence over. So this is a government proposal, of course. It is one where I think local government has been able to have more oversight in terms of being able to see what is being developed than we ever have before. And that is, in my view, a really good thing, because it allows us to have these kinds of interactions. It's not a usual thing. Normally we would have a bill presented into the House and we're straight off to select committee and working that way. So from my perspective, this is a far better system where I feel that as elected members and as a community, you're getting to understand and model and can give us your feedback before we get to that. So thank you all very much. Jason, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate that. I know you've been spending a lot of time with councillors around the country, and thanks, Pat, you've been doing some of that too, and we like a little bit of banter on these things, so hopefully it hasn't been too serious tonight. There is no, I would say in this, there is no perfect model for anything in life. It's actually doing the best with what you've got. So let's see how we go, and really keen to get your feedback so we can influence the best model possible for our region. Thanks, Paul, and Gareth for being in there behind the scenes supporting tonight's Zoom. So I'll say to you all, mā te wā, goodbye to you all. We'll see you again.